Hi everybody, thank you so much for signing up for the Seam Finishes class. My name is Christina and I'm going to be your instructor. You're going to need to have your supplies with you as you watch this video. You can stop at any time and practice or watch it all the way through and then do the things whenever you want to. I'm going to chunk out the video into certain sections so that before I start a new seam finish type, I'll have the title of it. So if there's something that you already know, because there's going to be some really basic stuff and then some more advanced stuff toward the end. So if there's anything that you already know how to do, just go ahead and skip that. And you're going to need your handouts too. This is just something from an old college textbook that I had. So it's a little antiquated, I apologize. But we're gonna go ahead. I think the descriptions are pretty well written on these, and it just gives you something to refer back to visually too. So on the first page of your handout, under the title Seam Finishes, I'm just gonna read through that and just talk about some general things, and then we're gonna go ahead and do some sewing. Of some seam finishes, and I'm going to kind of talk about the different types of seam finishes as I'm sewing them as well, because that's kind of how I teach. I kind of like to just say things as they occur to me. So hopefully it's all clear. This is why we do the Zoom call at the end, or I guess we're going to be doing it on Thursday, so that I can help you with clarifications, or if you have any questions or anything like that, if I say anything like a crazy person. Okay, so under seam finishes, it just says a seam finish is any technique used to make a seam edge look neater and or keep it from fraying. 3 considerations determine the seam finish decision. So the type and weight of fabric, does it fray excessively, a little, or not at all? Another thing you need to consider is the amount and kind of wear and care that the garment will receive. If the garment is worn often, then tossed into the washing machine, the seams need a durable finish. If the style, here's where it's antiquated, if the style is a passing fad or will be worn infrequently, you may elect not to finish the seam edges. And third thing is whether or not seams will be seen. An unlined jacket warrants the more elaborate bias binding finish. A lined garment requires no finishing at all unless the fabric frays a great deal. I totally agree with that. Yeah, unless something is frays a lot, or else if you're gonna wash it a lot, I would not finish a lined garment. Plain straight seams are finished after they have been pressed open. Generally, there are some exceptions to that rule, just in kind of more modern sewing. Plain curved or cornered seams are seam finished right after stitching, next clipped or notched, then pressed open. So take that for what it is. You can, I'm gonna go through all these things too. And so yeah, for this class, when you finish these seams, you're going to need 2 yards of bias tape and about 16 pieces of muslin or just some kind of scrap fabric that are generally 18 inches by 3 inches. Again, if you don't want to practice all the seams like you've done it a million times, please don't feel like you need to do that, because, you know, if you zigzagged seam before, then you know it's going to be the same thing. I'm not going to show you anything different. So we're going to first start with the pinked seam. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to mention so I don't forget is that all the seam allowances on these pieces are going to be 5/8 inch. So the big 4 pattern companies, Vogue, Buttrick, McCall's, Simplicity, always design their patterns with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, unless otherwise noted, which will say on your pattern. I would say that the indie patterns, the newer patterns, don't always have a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Sometimes I'm seeing 1/2 inch, sometimes I'm seeing 3/8 of an inch. But for these practices, we're gonna always do a 5/8 inch seam allowance, assuming that the pattern is designed for that. If you have an indie pattern that is like a 3/8 inch seam allowance and you want to do a French seam on that, I would probably put a little bit more seam allowance on your pattern before you cut it out, so that you can do a really nice French seam that the 2 steps will equal a 5/8 inch seam. So yeah, here we go. And I hope you like doing these seam finishes. I kind of am a nerd, and I love to do these. So here we go. Okay, so this first seam finish that we're going to talk about is the pinked seam finish. On the handout it says it's cut along edge of seam allowance with pinking shears. So here are my pinking shears. They're these ziggy-zaggy scissors. Sometimes if you get stuff from the thrift store or vintage things, you'll see things with the edges pinked. It's just kind of a way to prevent the seams from fraying. I would say that if it's something you're going to wear a lot or wash a lot, I would not pink my seams. A lot of times you'll see pinked edges on, like, if you know, on the inside of like a tailored suit. A lot of times they'll do it to kind of reduce bulk in fabric as well. So cut along the edge of seam allowance with pinking shears for best results. Do not fully open shears or close all the way to the points. If fabric is crisp and lightweight, it is possible to trim the 2 edges at once before pressing seam open. Otherwise, do 1 edge at a time. Pinking is attractive, but will not itself prevent fraying. So what I've done, so here's the sample of a pinked edge. Hopefully you can see that okay. All I did was sew my seam, and then like this. So here's my piece of fabric. I sewed a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then I'm just going to take my pinking shears and just cut the edges off. That feels like that's a better way to go. And yeah, sometimes pinking shears can be really stiff. So to get kind of a nice edge, just kind of try to do as long cuts as you can. And good enough is good enough. I'm going to say that like a million times. It's kind of my sewing saying all the time, is good enough is good enough. So I'm just cutting that edge with my pinking shears all the way down. Get rid of that. And then, oh, I didn't get a little bit right there, but it's okay. We're just messing around. So then I'm going to go ahead and bring my little ironing board over here. Open up my seam and press it open. Let me turn it this way. Oh, my iron's really steaming. So I'm just going to take the tip of my iron and press that seam open all the way down. Just like that from the inside. And then usually I flip it over and then press it from the top side too. So there you go. There is your pinked edge. When I teach this class at Fancy Tiger, a lot of times what I'll have people do is, and this is just if you want to like take a pen or something and write pinked, so that you know that that edge is pinked. So easy as that. If this were heavier fabric like the handout said, you would have to press it open first and then cut the edges separately. But since this is lightweight fabric, we just did it first and then pressed it open. So that is a pinked edge. So next we're gonna go ahead and do the turned and stitched one. Okay, so this next one is called Turned and Stitched, and referring to our handout, Turned and Stitched, also called Clean Finish. Turn under edge of seam allowance 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch if fabric frays easily. Press, stitch along edge of fold. It may be helpful on difficult fabrics or curved edges to place a row of stitching at the 1/8 or 1/4 inch fold line to help turn edge under. This is a neat, tailored finish for lightweight to medium weight fabrics and is suitable for an unlined jacket. So I'm gonna hold this up so you can kind of see what that ends up looking like. I'm also gonna tell you too that matching thread is gonna be your best buddy here, because you're gonna see where my stitches aren't very straight, but again, we're just messing around, we're just playing. So I actually have red thread because I want this to be able to show up on camera. What they mean by stitching a line first, where you're gonna fold it. So here's my piece of fabric that I'm gonna use as my sample. So if you wanted to have a kind of a perforated, I guess you can kind of consider it like a perforated line. So you're gonna stitch right there on one edge of the fabric at 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch, and then you're gonna press it where you stitched it. So it kind of tells the fabric where to press. I've never really done that because I don't know, honestly, I don't really use this finish very much. This finish, if you wanna see, has on the underneath side is a raw edge. So if I were to wash this, it's still gonna fray because it's only turned under once. So I would say that you would use this in maybe like something you're gonna dry clean, or something that really isn't gonna be washed very much, because all you're really doing is just pressing that edge back and stitching it down. So it's not really gonna prevent fray that much. So this is how you're gonna do this. So I have, again, here's my sample piece. I just sewed a 5/8 inch seam allowance. What I'm gonna do is press my seam open. Like that, and then I'm going to flip my fabric this way. So I just have one layer here, and I'm flipping it face down on top of my little sleeve board. I usually use a full ironing board for this, but just for the sake of a video, I'm just using my little sleeve board. So I don't know, I would much rather be hanging out at my full-sized ironing board. So just know that. Okay, so now I'm going to do is fold back this edge about 1/4 inch, because I'd rather do 1/4 than 1/8, and press that back. And I'm just eyeballing it. Get the rest of it folded down there. There we go. So that's pressed down. So I'll open it back up so you can see the whole thing. So I pressed my seam open, and then just this one side, I pressed this back. Also, if I were really doing this for real, I would go ahead and do the other edge at this point to press that back. But just for the sake of the video, I'm only gonna do one side, because you don't need to sit here and watch me press and sew, because, you know, it's not that exciting. So the only thing is, if you press one side and then go to press the other side, make sure you're not gonna unpress the first side. So if it's easier, you can press one side, sew it, press the other side and sew it. The next thing I'm going to show you, I'm going to mention this a couple times during this video, but for this kind of sewing, because on the sample you can see that your stitch lines are pretty close to that edge right there. So a tool that I have found really handy, that I absolutely love, our machines at Fancy Tiger, we have a few of them. They don't usually come standard with a machine. You have to buy them extra. but it's called an edge stitch foot. For my machine, I had to buy this as an extra thing, but it has come in so handy and I love it ever so much, because when you're trying to do just a straight stitch line on a hem or top stitching or anything, an edge stitch foot comes in so handy, and it makes your sewing look a lot better. So I would highly recommend getting one of these. You don't have to, you know, for most of my sewing life, because I've only had this less than a year, for most of my sewing life, I just eyeball it and I just sew, which is totally fine. But just saying, I'm gonna show you how to use this just in case you're interested. So turn my machine on. And my presser feet change differently from the presser feet for the Janome machines we have at the store. So just, if you are confused as to how your presser feet change on your machine, look that up in your manual. Bernina's tend to be a little more tricky because they're fancy. So here, I'm gonna try and make sure that we can see this pretty well. So I'm gonna sew this with my edge stitch foot. And move my needle over just a little bit more. So what's happening with this edge stitch foot, I don't know if you can see it or not, but there's a little wall that kind of drops down when I lower the presser foot, and it just prevents my fabric from shifting past that wall, so therefore making my stitches really straight, because I certainly can't sew that straight eyeballing. But again, matching thread color, right? So giving you the true test here with a really contrasting thread color. All right, so that side of the seam is sewn. Trim my threads. And I'm gonna hold that up and show you, hopefully you can see how nice and straight that stitches on that edge. So again, if I were really doing this for real, I would also press back my other edge and stitch that down as well. So that is called turned and stitched. Pretty self-explanatory, yeah? So the next one we're gonna do is zigzagging, which is probably the most common seam finish in home sewing. So here are my two samples of my zigzagged seam finishes. I'm gonna read on the handout first, and so on that part of zigzagging, it says, set stitch for medium width and short length, about 1.5, sorry, I can't see this, about 50 something per inch. I'll tell you on my machine, go. My eyes sometimes. Stitch on edge of seam allowance without exceeding it, and then trim the excess fabric to the edge of the seam allowance. Okay, so let's stop right there. I have never in my life done that. I always just zigzag right on the edge. So for your machine settings, you want to go to your widest zigzag. On my machine, the widest width is a 5, and then your length pretty much always hangs out at about 2.5. And someday in my sewing life, I'm going to know 2.5, it's 2.5 stitches per something. I don't know what that is. Someday I'm gonna find out and I will let you know. So that's kind of an average stitch length is 2.5. And then most machines, the machines at Fancy Tiger, also their widest width setting would be a 5. So for a regular fabric like this is kind of comparable. This muslin's comparable to like a quilt weight cotton. So I would leave it at that. If I have a fabric that's really, really ravelly, so like a loose weave linen or just anything with a loose weave that really wants to fall apart, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shorten my stitch so that my zigzag still is as wide as the widest width, but I'm going to shorten the length so the zigzags are squished together a little bit more, so they have a tendency to catch those little fibers that want to fray better than if I just had a regular 2.5 stitch length. So anyway, all that said, also in here too, they say to zigzag within the edge and then cut. I've never done that. I just zigzag right on the edge. So disregard that, or try it if you want to, but honestly, this is how I teach it, and this is, I've done this for a long, long time, and it works just fine. And this is one of the quickest and most effective ways to finish a fabric that frays. A zigzag finish can be used on a knit, but care must be taken not to stretch the seam edge or it will ripple. Generally, I don't finish the edges of my knits because they don't fray, so they don't need it. So anyway, these are the two ways that you can do a zigzag stitch. This one is zigzagged first, then straight stitched and pressed open. This one is straight stitched and then zigzagged together. I'm gonna do the straight stitch first and then zigzag together just for the sake of timing. But just know that if you want your seam allowance to be open, like this one, I would highly recommend zigzagging your edges first and then straight stitching your edges together at 5/8, and then pressing them open. Either way is okay. This is kind of more of a purist way, and especially like if you want something, if you want your seam allowance to be open, when you do like a hem or something, that kind of flattens out that extra fabric and it reduces bulk. So this is probably a better way to do things. I'm a quick and dirty sewer, so I've done this like a million times. So same thing, if I straight stitch first and then zigzag and then I fold it up, there's just a little bit more bulk right there. But whatever, it's whatever works for you. The only thing that I'm gonna say is when you zigzag, make sure that you zigzag at 1/8 is your seam allowance setting, so it kind of is on, off the fabric edge. You don't want to get too deep into your seam allowance when you zigzag. The purpose of the zigzag is to catch these little fibers that want to fray off, and if you're too far into your seam allowance, it's not going to do that. So I'm going to show you how we do that. So I already have my sample piece sewn, and here is my 5/8 inch seam allowance, and I'm just gonna zigzag right on that edge right there. So I'll turn my machine on. I'm gonna go to my widest width, and since this is kind of a medium weight fabric that doesn't fray a whole lot, I'm just gonna leave my length at 2.5. So the thing that you need to remember, and my machine doesn't have seam allowance markings, we're just kind of good friends and I know where my seam allowance markings are, but I know our machines at Fancy Tiger will have the seam allowance markings listed on there, and I always tell my students 1/8, an eighth of an inch is your seam allowance when you zigzag. And I'm gonna do this in slow-mo and hopefully you can see. So let me scooch it over just a little bit, and you don't have to backstitch on the zigzag. So I'm gonna like this. I'm just going to do it with the hand wheel so you can see it a little slower. So it kind of zigs on and zags off like that. It kind of jumps off the edge a little bit like that. So you don't have to backstitch because you're not holding two pieces of fabric together with your zigzag. You are just finishing the edge. So there it is. See how it's like right there on the edge. And a lot of times, you still get these little ravelies. If that bugs you, you can go back and cut those off. But That's the most common way on a home machine that you're gonna finish a seam. I do this all the time. This is, if I have my home machine, just my home machine, I'm doing this, or else I use my serger, and that's a different class for a different day. So that's a zigzagged edge. And again, just to reiterate, if you want your seam to be open like that, then make sure you zigzag your edges at 1/8 first, so each separately, and then you're gonna go back and sew your 5/8 inch seam afterwards. Sometimes patterns will tell you to sew your seam and then go back and zigzag those edges afterwards, and that makes me wanna lose my religion, so usually I zigzag first. All right, so that, my friends, is zigzagging. Next, we're gonna go on to the beautiful, beautiful French seam, which you're gonna love. I hope you love. I love a French seam. All right, so here is our beautiful French seam. French seams are, I don't know, I think they sound real fancy, but they're really not that hard. And I've done many a French seam in my day. They're really pretty. I would totally recommend doing a French seam on something that's really special to you. It's a very strong seam. Also, if you have something that is sheer, like a sheer fabric, and like, you know, I don't know, like if you have a sheer jacket or something and you can see through it and somebody's going to be able to see the seams, highly recommend a French seam. So I'm going to hold it up so you can see the beauty of the French seam, like that. So it's a 2-step seam, but totally worth it, I think. Reading on the handout, French seam is stitched twice, once from the right side and once from the wrong side. It is the classic seam for shears and looks best if the finished width is 1/4 inch or less. And with wrong sides of fabric together, stitch a 3/8 inch seam allowance, trim the seam allowance to 1/8, press it open, fold right sides together with stitch line exactly on the edge of fold, and press again, stitch on the seam line, which is now 1/4 inch from the fold, press seam to one side. Okay, so all those words. So here's our little sample. I'm gonna put that to the side. So what's weird about a French seam, and if you've been sewing at all for very long, this is gonna feel really counterintuitive. So what I've done is since my muslin is the same on the front and the back, I've kind of marked just like little stars on one side of each of my muslin pieces so that I can tell the difference between the right side and the wrong side. So this is my design on my fabric. So that's going to be considered the right side, and then the plain side will be the wrong side. When I teach this at Fancy Tiger, I usually have people, you can write RS and WS or whatever you want to do so that you're clear on what the wrong side and the right side is. So the weird thing about this is that almost always, you put right sides together and sew your seam. Not to be with the French seam, you're actually going to put wrong sides together first. Since it's a 2-step seam, you want wrong sides together first, and then when you do your second pass, that'll flip it to the right. Then you'll flip it to right sides together. So I'll show you what that is. So your first seam allowance is going to be just a 3/8 inch seam allowance, just regular straight stitch. So I'm going to put my fabric together, and again, I'm going to say this a million times because I always have to remind myself, wrong sides together first. So see how my pretty star fabric is on the outside. So this is 3/8 first pass, wrong sides together. Okay, so there is my first pass at 3/8. Make sure my iron's working up. There we go. Okay, so first pass, wrong sides together, 3/8. So now what I'm gonna do is get my scissors and I'm gonna trim that 3/8 inch seam down to 1/8. And all this is doing is just kind of gonna make sure that when you flip it, that there's not gonna be any ravelly edges. Also, when doing a French seam, you need to do a little math. So you need to make sure that your 2 passes of your seam allowance equals 5/8 or the total of your seam allowance. So since I did 3/8, my next pass is gonna be 2/8, which equals 1/4. So the 2/8 and the 3/8 equals my 5/8. Okay, so I trimmed my seam down. I'm gonna pull my little iron over here, ironing board. And what I'm gonna do is, so if I were a more purist sewer, I would take these little edges. Maybe I can do it, I don't know. Sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't. Take those little tiny seam little bits and I'm gonna open them up and press them out. Quite get it all. And my iron is so steamy. All right, so press that tiny little seam allowance open, and now what I'm going to do is flip it so I have right sides together, and I'm going to press it again. Sometimes I'm lazy and I don't do that first step of pressing it open. Sometimes I just go then right sides together and kind of roll my seam to make sure that that seam line's right there at the top. But since I pressed it open, it's going to be nice and tidy. So now I'm just pressing again, right sides together, all like that. And now I'm going to go back again with my straight stitch and do my 1/4 inch seam. I've made the mistake before of maybe going too deep with this seam. Where's my sample? Let's see if we can, oh, did I lose it? Oh, it's right here. The reason why you really want to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance is because it creates this kind of little flap on the inside. And if that were big, that could get a little awkward. So if this were, any bigger than 1/4 inch, it's going to be kind of flappy on the inside of your garment or whatever you're making. So I like to have this end up being 1/4 inch, and you end up afterwards just pressing it to one side. So just know that I've made the mistake of making it bigger than that, and it's just kind of an awkward thing. So I'm going to go back here and do 1/4 inch. And I'm just enclosing that raw edge, so I always like to flip it open and make sure that I don't see any ravelies in my seam there, there's maybe one little baby. So if you need to trim a few little ravelies, go ahead. And then you're just going to then press this to one side or the other. So there is a pretty, pretty French seam. Isn't that fun? And not hard, right? Okay, moving on. This next one is the mock French seam. Just reading the handout here, can be used in place of the French seam, especially on curves where a French seam is difficult to execute. With right sides of fabric together, stitch on the seam line, trim seam allowance to 1/2 inch, turn in the seam edges 1/4 inch and press, matching folds along the edge stitch these folded edges together, press seam to one side. So yeah, mock French, they're saying it's gonna be a little easier on like a curved seam. Although, just a little my own experience here, I used to have a line of clothes and we did French seams on everything, and we did French seams on curved seams too. We didn't have anything that was terribly, terribly curved. Not like a really curved sleeve cap or anything like that. That'd be a little scary. But I would probably go with a French seam over a mock French. But let's do mock French anyway, huh? So same, you're gonna use it in the same way that you would the French seam, like with shears or just kind of to really reinforce your seam. All right, so here's my mock French seam, just like that. So the thing about it is that there's my original seam, and then the edges get kind of pressed down together, and then you stitch them together. So you do see another line of stitching right there. And again, this is where your edge stitch foot and matching thread color is going to be your best buddy. So what I have done already is just taken my muslin piece, sewn a regular 5/8 inch seam allowance, just for the sake of time, because you don't need to watch me sew that. And I'm going to then trim this. Since it's 5/8, I'm just going to trim 1/8 off, or thereabouts. Also, if you have a rotary cutter or something like that, that would be a much quicker, going off the edge there, a much quicker way and straighter and faster way to trim a little bit of this off. So if I were in my sewing studio, I would just use my rotary cutter, because I am not cutting very straight. I can already tell. That's going to be really embarrassing. All right, pretty. All right, get rid of my extras and clean that puppy up just a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to then press my seam open like that. And then what I'm going to do is take each side and fold it toward the stitch line about halfway. Because if I did indeed trim this to 1/2 inch, half of that would be my 1/4 inch. Wow, not my best ironing job. So that's that one side. I'm gonna flip it around, do the other side. Again, press toward the center and attempt to not press out my first crease that I just did. Try to get actually something here. All right, so then I'm going to take these two folds towards each other. Fold them together, then I'm going to flip it. Let's see, probably see better that way. So that the two folds are folded toward each other. And I'm going to press that together. This is not my favorite thing to do. Almost there. That's why I don't like all these very fiddly little folding things. It gets to be a little bit tedious. And I can't tell you that I would have the patience to do this for an entire garment, but that's me too. And if it's worth it, then it's good to take the time. All right, so good enough. Those are together, and now again, I'm going to switch out my foot and put on my edge stitch foot, because at least that way I know this is going to look somewhat decent. And maybe move my needle just a skosh. There she is. There's that mock French seam. And again, if you don't have an edge stitch foot, which please don't think I'm telling you, you have to have one. You very much don't. You could just eyeball that too, because it's going to be on the inside. So pretty. It'll do the trick, right? So the next thing we're going to do is a flat felt seam. So let me get set up for that, and we'll be right back. So now here is the flat felled seam. Let me show you my sample. There's the sample. This is a really great seam. Most times you're going to see this on like the inseams of jeans. You see it on like kids stuff, because it's just a really super sturdy seam. Also, it's going to be a little weird because you do things, the seam is totally created on the right side of your fabric, so you see this seam. There is a special foot that I think our handout talks about, a felling foot or a flat felling foot, that if you end up doing a lot of flat felled seams, I would highly recommend getting that foot. I don't have one of those, but yeah, if it's something that you're really digging, I've heard that they're great. But you can also do it with your regular presser foot. So flat felled seam is a very sturdy, and so is often used for sports, clothing, and children's wear. Since it's formed on the right side, it is also decorative, and care must be taken to keep widths uniform within a seam and from one seam to another. So this is how you do it. With wrong sides of fabric together, so same way that we started the French seam. Stitch on the seam line, press seam open, then to one side, trim the inner seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch, press under the edge of the outer seam allowance, this is the bigger one, 1/4 inch, stitch this folded edge to the garment. Be careful to press like seams in the same direction. So for example, both shoulder seams to the front. A felling foot or jeans foot is available for some machines. This foot rolls the fabric as it stitches. So I've never done that, but I have known people that really, really like that a lot. All right, so this is how we're gonna do that. So I have already gone ahead and sewed my sample together, wrong sides together, 5/8 inch seam allowance, just for the sake of time. So again, I put my little pretty stars to show that that is my right side, and I sewed my wrong sides together. So then the next thing that we're gonna do is I'm gonna press this seam open. And while I'm doing that, so you need to figure out which direction the seam needs to go before you trim, because like it said in the instructions, need to go the same direction. So you don't want to have one shoulder seam that goes towards the front and the other that goes toward the back, because that's going to look weird. So this is the step where you're going to then figure out which seam allowance you're going to trim, and that's the seam allowance that's going to get covered. So we're going to pretend that, you know, maybe this is the body of the shirt, and so this is my shoulder seam, and so this is it's gonna fold toward the front of the shirt. So I'm going to trim this seam allowance down. Again, if I had, getting short, really close there. If I had a rotary cutter, could do that with your rotary cutter, but this is going to get covered up, so not to worry. Just trimming that down to about 1/8. Then I'm going to open it back up, and then this side, the one that's my bigger seam allowance, I'm going to fold under about, let me see what they say. So you're going to fold this outer seam, so since it's about 1/8 as well, because when I fold it over my trimmed seam, I want this to be about 1/4 inch. So what that felling foot does is it turns the fabric, this edge down, and stitches it at the same time, which would come in real handy. So I don't think you'd necessarily have to press it. You just stick that foot on. I'm not used to sitting down and ironing, so I have to stand up. Maybe my ironing will be more accurate if I stand up. So I'm just pressing that under about 1/8 to 1/4 inch. Just try to keep it the same. Pretty good. And then I'm going to flip it so it's covering up my trimmed seam. Oops. Technical difficulties. There we go. Flip it and press it down. Like that. And then all I need to do is just stitch that down. So I'm not going to put my edge stitch foot on. Can you tell I love my edge stitch foot so very much? But I'm not going to do that this time. I'm just going to stitch this down. Just eyeball it. So yeah, I'd want to be pretty darn exacting with this, because generally this is going to be a contrast thread color like you see on the inseams of jeans. You know, it's usually that kind of goldy thread. So yeah, if you do a lot of this, a flat felling foot would come in real handy, but honestly, I don't think that's so bad. I don't know. All right, so we're gonna move on to doing bound seams next. So I will be right back, and we're gonna do a bias bound seam. So here's our bias bound seam, and this is a really nice one. I actually really like this one a lot. Reading the handout, bias bound, you're going to trim notches. What they mean by that is a lot of times on, after you cut out a pattern, there might be like a notch or something that kind of sticks out from your seam allowance. So you're going to trim those off just so you have a straight edge. And wrap bias tape around it. Use ready-made tape or cut your own from lining or underlining fabric. Stitch close to the edge of top fold, catching underneath fold in stitching. Bias tape is especially good for finishing seams on an unlined jacket or coat. So I have seen that in ready-to-wear where they will have like a kind of a casual jacket, and you open it up and the seams are bias bound. It's kind of pretty. A lot of times you're going to see contrasting bias because it's kind of part of the design, even though it's on the inside. I have a friend who does this to the seams of his pants so that when he rolls up, so here's like the outside of his pants, but when he rolls up his cuff, you see this cute little contrasty bias edge, which is really cute, and I really love that. So this is how we're gonna do it. So I have sewn my 5/8 inch seam already, and I pressed it open. I'm gonna only do one edge of this. I'm not gonna do both edges because you'll get the concept. So just pressed it open, and I'm going to bind one edge. So this is how I like to do it. Sometimes I've seen people start from the top side of the seam and wrap it. I actually like to go underneath, and I'm going to take my bias tape and I'm going to flip it up so I can see this little crease right there, and I'm going to line up that crease, line up my edges together. So hopefully you can see that. So I've got right side to the right side of my bias tape is facing my stitch, just so that it's going to wrap around. If I can do this with just my fingers like that to the inside. So yeah, I like to go to the back of the seam, open up my bias tape, and then you're just gonna stitch right in that crease. Pin it if you want. I kind of feel like if you can just leave things lined up, you're gonna be good to go. So you're just gonna straight stitch right in that crease. So it's attached to the back side, and then now what I'm going to do is flip it over so it wraps around the edge like that. And I'm going to press it. And I'll show you the reason why I like to do this from the back side up to the front side in just a second. And really, so when I'm pressing it, I'm making sure that my folded edge of my bias is covering my stitch line like that. I don't want to see my stitches. All right, and now what I'm going to do is stitch this down. And again, I'm using red thread on this blue bias tape because I want you to see what's happening, but generally you want to match your thread color to your bias tape because that's going to be pretty invisible. And you're going to be stitching again. Sorry, back to that stupid edge stitch foot. You're going to get tired of me talking about it. It would come in handy for right now too. Doing lots of edge stitching on this. Okay, but I'm just going to eyeball it. So I want my needle to drop about like a 1/16 of an inch away from this fold right here, as close as I can. So I'm stitching this down, but it's not coming into the body of the bias tape a whole heck of a lot. I can already tell I'm not really stitching it down. Sometimes I get off and then I can't get back on. Let's remedy that. Come on, you. There we go. Sure I'm covering up those stitches. Wow, I'm driving like a crazy. Don't judge me. That was not my prettiest sewing. I can already tell. I was kind of on and off and on and off. I missed my edge stitch foot. Okay, so there it is. Again, not my finest work, but so that's stitched on. And if this were matching thread color, it wouldn't make a whole heck of a lot of difference if my stitching wasn't perfectly straight. So then you're gonna go and bind this other side too. And then you have a little bias bound edge. Next thing that we're gonna do, last seam finish we're gonna do, even if you're tempted, please don't skip this one because this one changed my life. I really, really love, it's called Hong Kong finish. Don't know why. I actually tried to look it up and nobody could tell me why it's called the Hong Kong finish. But it's pretty magical and you're gonna love it. And so don't be tempted to skip that one. So I'll be right back and we'll do Hong Kong finish. All right, so last but not least is Hong Kong finish. Looks a heck of a lot like bias bound, doesn't it? But I'm gonna tell you, it's a heck of a lot easier. So if you like the bias bound thing, you might really dig this. So it looks exactly the same as the bias bound except for on the flip side. And I will show you that when we get to it. We're reading the handout. Hong Kong, this is an alternative to the bias bound finish and is especially suitable for heavy fabrics. So you could use this in the same way that you would do if you were gonna use bias bound. And so you're going to cut 1.5 inches wide bias strips from lightweight fabric that matches the garment fabric, or use purchased bias tape and press it open. And we're gonna do it a little bit differently. So how about instead of me reading, I'm just gonna show you. So first thing I'm gonna do is grab my bias tape. And if you just make your own bias tape, you don't have to press it. You can just leave it flat. So what I'm gonna do actually is get my bias tape, my pre-purchased bias tape, and press it open. Just press it flat. Just pressed it flat. Get rid of that. So here is my 5/8 inch seam yet again, sewn and pressed open. So first thing I'm gonna do is, remember how with bias finish I had you start from the back and flip it around to the front? I'm actually gonna have you sew it right side to the front. So start from kind of the inside of the seam instead of the outside of the seam. I hope that makes sense. That is sounding a little kooky, I know. And what you're gonna do is sew that right side to right side at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Like so. Try to get just 2 edges together like that. So sewn together at a 1/4 inch, right side to right side. Now comes the magic. So now what you're gonna do is, I'm gonna bring my little ironing board over, flip this around. Let me open it up so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so there's my seam. Opened that up flat, right side to right side, stitched it at a 1/4 inch. Now I'm going to iron this, flip it all back, and iron this over my seam, just all flattened out like this. Let's see if my iron will reach. Just gonna iron that up just so I know where I'm going with it. Iron that to cover it. My fabric is so thin that it's having a hard time figuring out where the edge is. All right, so now I ironed that over, still all flattened out. And next thing I'm gonna do is stitch this down, this bias tape down right here. Let me see if I can point to it with my little scissors. So you're gonna be sewing, your stitch is gonna land right there. It's called stitch in the ditch. So I'm gonna stitch in the ditch. Again, matching thread color is gonna be your best buddy with this, and I'm gonna try my best to stitch right in the ditch. And you know what I'm gonna say if I had my edge stitch foot. So that is stitched down. I made that kind of skinny. If you wanted kind of more bias tape showing, you could sew it at a deeper seam allowance. And you say, but Christina, what about the rest of the bias tape? So all you're gonna do is then go to the back of your seam and just trim that off. The reason why you can do that is because bias tape is of course cut on the bias, so it does not fray, which is really great. So I can just cut it and not worry about those edges fraying. So I'm just gonna trim that off. Again, if I was in my studio and I had a rotary cutter, I could just trim that off real quick. But I just did it with my scissors. And you go and do the other side, but isn't that pretty? So here, let me show you my sample of where both sides are done. So there's a Hong Kong finish. And then you can see where this is just this is just cut. There's no folded edge or anything. It's just cut, and that's going to be just fine because again, it's on the bias. It won't fray. Isn't that cool? You get such a really great finish. I think this looks really amazing, and it is easy. All right, so that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to us talking on Zoom. Please come to me with any questions, anything that you want me to clarify, and I'm happy to do that, and I'm excited to meet you. All right, thanks so much. Bye.